Hello, we are back again, and our next session is on screen times. And this, we believe, for all of us, is a very topical, important topic. So I'll first introduce my co-chair, Dr. Ramya Mohan, who is a consultant child psychiatrist based in London and in Bangalore. Ramya is not only a doctor, she's a versatile person, medical educator, music composer, trained singer, exhibiting artist, invited author, orator, humanitarian worker working across Asia and Europe. She is an alumna of Bangalore Medical College and she trained in psychiatry from the South London and Maudsley's training scheme. And she will be chairing this session along with myself. The two speakers I'll introduce. The first speaker is Dr. Chhitij Srivastava. He is an associate professor at the MLN Medical College, Allahabad, and is also the research affiliate at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neurosciences, London, and adjunct faculty at the Center for Behavior and Cognitive Sciences, University of Allahabad. All of you know him. He is the Secretary General of ICAM India, and he's also one of the founder members of ICAM India, along with Ramya and myself and some of the others. Chhitij is a keen cyclist, runner, and a swimmer. You would see him in various parts of the country. The other speaker in this session is Dr. Max Davie. He's a consultant community pediatrician from Evelina Community Services and Health Improvement Officer of the Royal College of Pediatrics in UK. He's the author of RCPCH, Royal College of Child Health, Screen Time Guidance. So over to you, Ramya, Chhitij, and Max. Chhitij, you can go first.
Thank you, Shaumitro, for a very kind introduction. The bit I like the most is the runner, cyclist, and swimmer. That is something I'm most passionate these days. Just trying to share my screen. Yes, as we heard Shaumitro say, there will be two presentations, one by me and one by Max Davie. So I'll try and present what is partly based on my clinical observations in clinic, my clinical observations with kids, and try to back it up with some recent Indian research mostly that I've read recently, along with some work that I've been part of relevant to this area of screen time. So let's look at the digital boom which India has seen, the world has seen. So in 2016, only 22% of mobile users were using smartphones, so less than 1/4. So this figure is more than 50% in 2020 and is estimated to be nearly 100% by 2040. So almost everyone who would be using a phone, it would be a smartphone by 2040. And as we all know, the most common screen type in India is a smartphone, not a computer, not a TV, not a big tablet. It's mostly a smartphone. These are common scenes in India. So you see a person riding with their phone on, talking, texting. And my wife said I should even put my picture in there because I spend a lot of my time on my phone or on my computer. So we're all addicted in some ways to our screen. We've also seen increased screen time in the young population. These are also common scenes in most households. Just looking at some recent studies. So this was a 2018 study from an urban area of New Delhi. So the community-based cross-section study looked at 550 adolescents and nearly using, these are adolescents, so it's sort of expected. But they're pretty similar findings with very young kids, so 15 to 18 months of age kids. So this study again looked at an urban area of Delhi, 370 mother-baby pairs, all, mark my words, all except one toddler was exposed to screen-based media starting as early as 2 months. So often the first toys that a child experiences is not a sensory or a motor-based toy, but a smartphone. And smartphone along with TV are the most common screen-based apps in India, which is in this study for more than 1 hour per day for very young kids. And I can say that it's pretty common to what I see in clinics. So I would see a family who would have come to consult for their 10-year-old daughter, and while they wait in the waiting room, their 4-year-old son would be busy on a smartphone, playing games, watching videos almost constantly. So it's like a teether that they give to their small child. In this study, so out of only 2 parents had any knowledge of the recommendations. The recommendations are no screen time for first 2 years. More than 50% thought the screen activities were beneficial, which could be the case depending if they were using some educational stuff. But the most common reason was not education. It was to engage the child as the caretaker was busy. So essentially, they're using the phone as a proxy parent, and to calm the child when the child has a tantrum. Child has a tantrum, they give the phone to the child. Child has to wait for half an hour, they give the phone to the child, and it's too easy for them. So essentially, the phone is being used as a proxy parent. In most of these mother-baby pairs, dinner time was associated with screen time viewing. It's an important thing based on what we'll talk in a few minutes when I look at other studies. So I just look at some of the cases to make it clinically relevant. So this is not just one case that I'm pointing at. I see a number of similar cases. So a parent comes to my clinic, says my child was developing normally till he was 18 months of age when the pandemic started. We gave him the smartphone because there was nothing else for him to do, and almost forgot about him. He had words then, but now at 3 years of age, he hardly communicates. So I've seen a lot of kids in my clinic when parents have come with these complaints. Not to say that screen time has led to speech regression, but something that we have to look at. What exactly is this doing? So looking at some recent research, so this is a 2021 study from Tamil Nadu, which looked at kids less than 5 years of age who had a mean screen time of nearly 2.5 hours per day, mostly smartphones and television. Now, prevalence of excessive screen time. So excessive screen time is any screen time before the age of 2 years and more than 1 hour of screen time between the age of 2 and 5 years. So prevalence of excessive screen time was 73%. So nearly 3/4 of this group. The study found that increasing screen time was significantly associated with developmental delay, specifically language and communication. So that's something to be kept in mind. It's possible that the link may be bidirectional, but we cannot be sure unless we have more research in the near future. A Chinese study looked at more than 100 kids with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and compared them with around 50 odd typically developing kids. Screen time was clearly more in the ASD kids, which is probably true because we know that it's easier for these kids to engage on their smartphones and things. But the increasing screen time was also associated with more autism symptom severity, especially with sensory symptoms and general developmental delay. Looking at this French Eden cohort, which has more than 1,500 kids, this had a slightly different finding than what most people expect. So they followed up kids at different age groups at age 2, 3, 5, and 6. What they found at age 2 was quite interesting in that kids who had no screen time and kids who had excessive screen time, both these groups did worse than kids who had some screen time, which probably means that some screen time may be beneficial because it may have more educational content, more interactive content. Now, this association was not there at other age groups. However, at all the age groups that these kids were followed up, the study found that any screen time during meal time had a negative correlation with language development. So any screen time at any age group, I think, which is very relevant, because meal times are traditionally times when a child spends a lot of quality interactive time with their parents. Also, even if the child is not watching television, even if the TV is just on because parents are watching it, it's still negative for the child because he's not able to pick up conversational exchanges with his parents. So it's clearly a distractor even in the background. However, although this is a 2021 publication, but data collection is old, between 2008 and 2012. And at that time, smartphones and tablets were not as common as we see them now. So the study did not examine smartphones and tablets. So mostly the screen time was television. And they did not analyze the content. So we know that television, it's more likely to be interactive as compared to smartphones, which becomes a solitary activity for the child. So that is something we have to keep in mind. However, the finding about meal times is also very relevant. That meal time screen time during this was associated with a poor outcome when it comes to language development. So that then really makes us question that, is it really just screen time that we are counting? Probably not. The content is very important, whether the screen is passive, the child is just watching something on the screen, or interacting while watching it. So if the child watches something with his parents, if the parents talk about what is happening, even if it's a cartoon, they talk about the stories, they bring the stories into the playtime, they bring similar cartoon characters and included in the child's toys and play with them, then it probably may have a positive impact. So interactive screen time may be much better. Social use, I think no one objects, especially during pandemic time. It has become a very important tool for communication. So video chats and smartphones have been a big savior. And educational content has seen a big boom, especially in India. So we have lots and lots of educational platforms now. So there's a big company which you would have heard, Byju's, that has platforms for kids as young as 4 years of age. They call it the pre-learner something. Now, whether the child is using a smartphone or a TV is very important. In India, it's mostly smartphone, which is worse than a TV or a laptop. Even if the child is using screen time, there should be some screen-free time, especially what the previous study said, the meal time should be screen-free and the bedtime should be screen-free. However, when you deal with Indian parents, even if the child is not using screen at all throughout the day, it's quite likely that he is using some screen during his meal times. With very young kids, that is the only way mothers will feed the child. They will play something, and while the child is watching that, the mother will feed the child. So screen time during meals is pretty common. Non-screen activities are important. So there's a balance. Screen probably doesn't harm that much. And it's always a worry when the child loses track of the time and spends most of his time on screen. Okay, so that was the first case. So I tried to club it with some recent research evidence. Looking at a different type of case, again, I've seen a number of cases like this. A 7-year-old with no ADHD. During the lockdown last year, medicine was stopped because of unavailability of doctors, and a lot of the medicines went out of stock. The parents say we gave him the smartphone to keep him engaged, and now he is addicted to it. He has extreme anger outbursts if his screen time is restricted, and has broken lots of things in anger. So some of these kids act in this manner. I've seen some kids with ADHD who present with dissociative symptoms, somatic symptoms, especially when it comes to restarting school these days, which means the screen time has been restricted. So lots of different types of presentations. So not everyone becomes addicted. So one clearly has to take into account the pre-existing vulnerability. So this kid who became, I mean, if you want to call it an addiction, it probably his ADHD contributed a lot, but not everyone has ADHD. So we have to look at the pre-existing vulnerability and the environmental condition that contributes to such addictive behaviors. Okay. So we started with ADHD. So look at some evidence for ADHD. So this study across South India looked at 50 odd kids less than 6 years of age. Screen time was above the recommended standards in 80% of preschool kids with ADHD. It's a median screen time of 140 minutes. 98% were using TV and 87% using smartphones. And there was a positive correlation with severity of ADHD. Again, it's a bi-directional relationship probably. Kids with ADHD more likely to engage on screen, and screen time is probably going to make them more impatient, more impulsive, and less likely to be able to focus on things which are not as exciting and stimulating as the smartphone or tablets or television. So somewhat similar findings from a Canadian longitudinal health cohort study, when they found that screen time was associated with inattention and externalizing symptoms. So clearly, ADHD makes one vulnerable to these addictive behaviors, because these kids are bored of ordinary activities. They're easily distractible. So anything like a smartphone is much more exciting. It's pretty much one-to-one. So it gives their dopamine deficient brains a lot of stimulation. And these kids like immediate versus delayed rewards. So if a child is playing on a smartphone, maybe a video game, they get constant rewards in various forms, like you moving to the next level or messages like you are a star or something along those lines. So these kids who are sensation seeking, impulsive and risky, it's much easier for them to much easier for them to get addicted into these activities. With ADHD, well, even older kids with ADHD do like multimodal stimulation, which is available on smartphones. Young kids are more distractible, so it's to focus on smartphones. So while ADHD is a vulnerable age, is also a vulnerability. Well, we just talked about this. So I'll skip this slide. So this just to show why it's easier for most people to focus on screen-based activities. I'm getting a message saying that my internet is unstable. I hope I'm audible. Yeah, I think so. Okay. I would bank on Sumitra to tell me if there's any problem with my audio video. Okay. Moving to the next case. Again, a very common scenario. So parent comes, says, my 11-year-old daughter, who has always been very anxious in social settings, remarkably, after the lockdown and when the schools were closed, her social anxiety improved because she didn't have to go to school, she didn't have to meet anyone. And we didn't have to go out, so there was no question of her feeling anxious. However, she got heavily into social media. The parents were happy, as she was happy. At least she was interacting with friends on an online platform, which was making her happy. While the lockdown lasted, while the schools were closed, it was all good. When things opened up again, now she has become extremely difficult. She refuses to part from her phone, has extreme anger outbursts, likes the kid with ADHD, but for a different reason. And now she's refusing to restart school. So someone who's vulnerable because of a limited social skills also takes to screen time very easily. And in the long run, it probably doesn't help their social skills. So it makes them even more socially anxious in the long run if they completely cut off from the real world. The social interaction might improve in the virtual world, and it may be helpful if they combine it with offline activities. But if it's online offline and they choose online activities or screen time activities, it doesn't help. So these kids are oversensitive, have poor social skills, low self-esteem, lots of social anxiety, low mood, poor emotional vocabulary, and poor coping mechanisms. So that's why they take the screen, and it makes all these vulnerabilities worse. So again, it's a bi-directional thing. So some research evidence to show that kids who are towards the addiction spectrum when it comes to screen time, they report more anxiety and depressive symptoms. So this was a 2013 study, and the study found that up to 25% were possible addicts, with nearly 1% as actually addicted to screen time. Okay, so we talked about the vulnerability. just look at the environmental conditions that would make these vulnerabilities manifest in the form of an addictive behavior. So easy availability, we all know that's been the case in the last couple of years and in the last decade actually, with easy availability of smartphones. Early exposure, lots of examples in India. I think pretty much everyone would agree that a lot of kids within the first 6 months are exposed to these devices. But poor parental supervision, busy parents, the smartphone becomes a proxy parent. School and peer influence, that's obviously true for pretty much everything. Social learning, so a lot of parents are also busy on the smartphone, so they really are not able to set good examples for their kids to follow. And parents who have psychiatric problems, they're likely to be even more unavailable. So these devices provide an escape from real life situations, and before they realize, they start becoming addicted to these gadgets. And then the secondary effects of screen or internet, which we talked about earlier. So an ADHD kid has more ADHD symptoms because of increasing time on these devices. A socially anxious kid develops more social anxiety symptoms because of hardly any exposure to real life social situations. Okay. Tasty. So my 10-year-old boy was very good in studies, was very interested in online classes initially. However, over time, he lost interest in these online classes, which has happened to a lot of kids I've seen. So they started off very well. They liked learning on this new platform. It was exciting. But then they found the platform more interesting than the studies. Subsequently, they moved to the device and forget about the classes. Now, when the school is actually opened up, he doesn't want to go back to school. He likes his phone much better and says that he rather have online classes, but actually last few months, he was hardly attending any online classes. So while we all agree that there's a lot of positive when it comes to online schooling, so no travel time, kids, some kids, I mean, if you're disciplined, you would have the better sleep routine. So you don't have to wake up very early to go to school. Lots of schools in India start very early. So with online classes, it's much more relaxed. Monetary savings, obviously. So I haven't had to buy any new school clothes for my daughter for the last couple of years. Lots of other savings, fuel savings, skill acquisition and using computers. That's been a big positive. Better connectivity, probably
sorry to
with
interrupt.
peers and teachers.
Chhitij,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Just a
Yes.
bit of housekeeping. About 5 more minutes. Would that be okay?
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up in 5 more minutes.
Great. Thank you so much.
So lots of advantages of audio. So lots of advantages of online schooling. However, we have to question: does it really increase the risk of addiction? The evidence is not clear. So probably not if it's used in a balanced manner. Let's quickly look at the recommendations from the government about online schooling in India. So the recommendations are that pre-primary students should have about 30 minutes a day. For classes 1st to 8th, there should be 2 online sessions of 45 minutes each. And classes 9 to 12, 4 sessions of 45 minutes each. Believe me, it's hardly ever followed. So my daughter, I know she's in class 8 and she has more sessions than a child who's going to 10th or 11th. There are lots of secondary effects of excessive screen time, which we're all familiar with. So I'll skip this for paucity of time, but the physical side effects, psychological side effects, social, and ultimately leading to academic failure and lots of other problems. Let's look at some screen time recommendations. So we're all familiar with these recommendations. So there should be no screen time for kids less than 2 years of age. And there should be maximum 1 hour sedentary screen time for kids up to 5 years. So WHO doesn't say 1 hour, it doesn't say maximum 1 hour, it says maximum 1 hour sedentary screen time. So there may be more if it's not sedentary. The Indian IAP, Indian Academy of Pediatrics, has similar guidelines, but doesn't use the word sedentary. So these are the guidelines by IAP. I'll just put some pictures. If you're interested, you can go through it. It's a pretty good guide with lots of pictures in it. So ICAM, which Sumitra referred to, that I'm a secretary of, this body is an Indian Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. So we did a CME on behavior addictions last year in October, and following that, we came out with a position statement on smartphone use, screen time use. So again, pretty similar recommendations, but we focus more on content, more on balance rather than actual number of hours, because we realize that if it's good quality screen time, some screen time may be beneficial, similar to what we've seen in the Eden Project study as well, with kids as young as 2 years of age. And then I'm also part of the Indian Psychiatric Society Child Psychiatry section. So we recently came out with a ebook, which talked about strategies for kids restarting school. So I won't go into the details, but if someone's interested, I'll be happy to send that to them. So looking at the services for screen time, so there are routine OPDs, which is how I see my kids with screen time problems. And there are lots of specialist OPDs. So specialist models are well developed in NIMHANS, Bangalore, where Professor Shadri is a professor, KGMC Lucknow, King George's Medical College, Lucknow. And there's a screen disorder de-addiction clinic in Allahabad, but that's not something I'm directly part of. Some educational material, just to showcase the sort of stuff NIMHANS are doing with some educational material. This is from a recent viewpoint that I published in Indian Journal of Social Psychiatry. So when I see kids who have excessive screen time, this is the model I try to follow when I try to treat them. So I look at the vulnerability. I look at the exposure to environmental stress. So if it's social anxiety, that may be a stress. Screen provides an escape to this. I look at the rewarding stimuli which the screen time provides. So if it's a video game, then obviously it's very rewarding. Over time, addiction sets in, which is sustained by both escape and reward. And then there are secondary physical, psychiatric, and psychosocial exploitation risks. So this is how I look at kids who come to me with screen time problems, which probably means that I'm treating multiple disorders, not just one screen time disorder. So it could be ADHD, internalizing disorders, lots of dissociative symptoms secondary to this. I'm looking at poor parenting, ODD conduct symptoms, then the actual addiction phenomena of withdrawal and craving, and of course, the risk of other addiction. And a recent study done at KGMC, it's unpublished, but I borrowed data from the person who's involved in the study. So this study looked at adolescents who had screen time addiction, behavior addictions to screen, and they found high rates of oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, dissociative, and depression. So similar to what my clinical experience has been so far. Okay, I'm not going to talk about management as such, but quickly mention that I do use pharmacological management mainly for the vulnerabilities if I think they are relevant. Most of my work is based on parenting and CBT, which I use a lot when I work with these kids. If you're interested, there's a dedicated issue on behavior addictions published in Indian Journal of Social Psychiatry, just come out this month, a few days ago. So all the articles are on behavior addiction. And that's my final slide. The take-home messages: don't just count the number of screen time hours, focus on quality and content, maintain a balance with offline activities, online activities to ideally complement offline ones rather than replace. And when you're treating behavior addictions, always assess for vulnerabilities. Don't treat them in isolation. Sorry for missing my this thing. I think I've probably run over my allotted time. Thanks for allowing me to finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chhitij. That was a very illuminating talk on how things are in India. Yes, and you're very very, very, very wonderfully touched upon the different aspects of what screen time constitutes, the concept of multimodal stimulation, very interesting statistics, including the ADHD study, which actually refers to 98% being actually based on TV. So that kind of challenges some of our notions about kind of what screen time actually constitutes in the Indian context. And I'm sure we're all curious and interested to hear from Max as well about the Western perspective. Max, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have a Western perspective. Gosh, yes. I also have almost the same shirt on as Chhitij, which is rather embarrassing, but I'm sure his is much nicer than mine, because it's famous Indian tailoring, of course. So yes, I am actually, I work most of the time in South London, and I'm with you thanks to the miracle of the internet. It is rather ironic that we're talking about screen time in the context of a meeting which is entirely mediated through screens. But anyway, most of the time I work in the Elephant and Castle, which is this wonderful place, the naming of which has nothing to do with elephants, oddly. But most of the time I live in this lovely place, Tame, which is a small market town in Oxfordshire, where I am now. So I just wanted to make use of your chat function. I'll bring up the chat now. Just to say, in your view, as a population, at a population level, taking the population as a whole, increased screen time has led to, how would you end that sentence? If you could just put stuff in the chat for me, that would be great. So increased screen time has led to. And I just want to, while I'm waiting for the responses to come in, I just want to make the point that I will be taking a UK perspective, but I'm going to try and connect it to the Indian perspective too. There are obvious differences between the experiences in India and the UK, although I suspect that we're very rapidly converging in terms of the experience. But I think the last 15, we had the boom in screen time earlier in terms of amount of exposure to screen time. I think we've transitioned to smartphones from TV at roughly the same time, but I think there are differences nonetheless. So we've got a few things that are leading to low concentration. We'll have a look at that. Leading to increased family discord. We'll have a look at that. And isolation and disconnection. And one of the things that people often say is it's led to increasing in autism, ADHD, it's led to increases in adolescent self-harm, emotional disorders, and so forth. And I just want to question the narrative here. Again, at a population level, as a spoiler for this talk, I think Chhitij and I end up practically, in terms of our advice, very, very similar places, but I think we come at it from a sort of different perspective at the kind of theoretical and public health level. Because the first question is, has screen time increased? And I think in an Indian perspective, that certainly is true. It definitely will have done. But we need to look at it at a Western perspective as well, because that is important in looking at some of the changes in prevalence of mental health disorders. And then have whatever we're thinking about in terms of child development and in terms of mental health, has it actually got worse, and are the two linked? So social media usage, this is US data, but the UK has very similar data. The point is, it hasn't really changed in the last 10 years. The amount of data, the amount of screen time being used by young children has not really changed in the last 10 years. The nature of it has changed, fine, but I don't think we can, and we'll go into later about whether we can actually generalize about what effects that has, and we can generalize about TV versus smartphones being more or less interactive. I'm skeptical that we can actually make those generalizations, if I'm honest. So it hasn't really gone up. So then again, I'm forcing you to take a very, very Western context, but just as a nice little guessing game, between 2004 and 2007, those are 2 points at which NHS Digital has done a comprehensive population survey of the prevalence of mental health disorders in the UK population. So I wanted guesses of what, in absolute terms, so not relative terms, absolute terms, the increases were between 2004 and 2017. What was the absolute terms increase? If I could have some guesses for that, that would be really helpful as well. Dennis, don't cheat. Okay, we've got a few guesses coming in, and that's about typical for the guesses that we get. But in fact, the answer is 1%. The absolute terms increase between 2014 and 2004 and 2017 is about 1%. So it goes up from about 10% to about 11% as a population whole. So we do not have, as a whole, up until pre-pandemic, we do not have an epidemic of mental health conditions in the UK. And my strong suspicion is that we do not have one anywhere in the world. I suspect that the same things happen, that if you had looked back pre-screen time, pre-internet, you would have found similar levels at population level as you do now. This 10% levels of mental health condition in the population was first found in the 1960s. So, and a lot of the variation, frankly, I think, is to do with changes in interpretation of criteria and so forth. So we just don't have the sort of problem, the kind of surge, certainly in diagnosable mental health conditions. But there are lots of, and Chhitij's talk is full of kind of associations between screen time and various adverse, not necessarily diagnostic outcomes, but so for instance, within ADHD severity, within autism, sensory issues and severity, and various other kind of softer, in a sense, outcomes. And that's fine, but of course we've got to be careful, and I think Chhitij was to say that association doesn't imply causation, but I would go further than that to say it doesn't necessarily mean it's bidirectional. It could be no directional. There could be no causal relationship between these two things that you are finding an association between. So there is, for instance, in the US, an association between the organic food sales per year and the diagnosis of autism. No one is suggesting that organic foods produces, well, maybe somebody on the internet and Facebook will say it, but it's, nobody seriously thinks that autism and organic food are actually causally linked. So finding an association is not great in terms of proving causation. So how do we prove causation? How do we actually do that? And some of the best work in proving causation between dosage of screen time, so they've got to be really clear about this, dosage of screen time and well-being, some of the best work on that has been done in Oxford by Andy Shabilsky and Amy Orban. And effectively, the graphs are very, very complicated because they did these incredibly complicated statistical analyses of various different ways of thousands of different ways of analyzing the same data set. And essentially, they found that having screen time or social media, similar really, was about as important as how many potatoes you eat. Whether you eat potatoes or not was about as important as screen time in terms of overall population-wise the well-being of children and adolescents. So it's a very, very small effect. And generally speaking, the better quality, the smaller the effect. The bigger the sample, the more kind of rigorous the statistical analysis, the smaller the effect becomes. So it looks like it's not a really significant effect overall of screen time or indeed social media on children as a population. Now, there is a caveat there that it might be that there are periods during maturation where there is a particular vulnerability, particularly to social media, and Amy has gone on to do some work there that suggests that early in puberty, boys, and late in puberty, girls may be more vulnerable to having some dip in well-being due to social media. So that is something to think about. But the final thing I would say about the kind of direct causal linking of screen time to negative outcomes is that I don't think I've ever seen an intervention study where reducing screen time is a primary intervention and there have been shown to be positive outcomes. If it is so toxic, surely removing it would be an effective therapeutic intervention. But I don't see any evidence that that's the case. So then they did a really interesting thing that also in Chhitij's presentation, that there were certain interventions in child development where children who had no screen time also did worse than children who had some. So it's that kind of Goldilocks hypothesis, not too hot, not too cold. And that's fine. And to an extent, I think that's probably kind of appeals to a lot of us, and the kind of moderation in all things, the kind of old Victorian adage. But on the other hand, it really depends what you're dealing with, how much is too much, and how much, where you draw the line between what is not enough and what is too much. I think no screen time at all does rob you of so many modern world, and I think it probably is a disbenefit. It probably is a kind of, it probably isn't. You're going to do worse if you're completely banned from screen time altogether. The question is how much is too much in terms of well-being. And this is some other work from Oxford, from Andy's lab. It really compares TV, computers, and video games. And video games have been replaced by social media as the bête noire of the day, but it's not necessarily. It'll be replaced by something else soon, but it was certainly up until recently it was very much something that people worried about. And as you can see, there's great variability of how much digital engagement it starts to go from neutral to low in terms of well-being outcomes. And actually TV is much worse than video games. Another reason why I challenge the idea that TV is necessarily kind of more interactive and less harmful, because I don't think sitting and watching TV is a terribly interactive activity compared to playing a video game online with some friends. I think that's a highly interactive activity, if I'm completely honest. So I think we need to be a bit careful about sort of about importing our own value judgments about the sorts of media that we enjoy and saying that that's more harmless than stuff that we don't necessarily indulge in. But the point here is you actually really have to play an awful lot of video games to have a measurable effect on your negative effect on your well-being. And it varies according to weekdays and weekends as well. So then there's lots of concerns, and this was also in Chhitij's presentation about child development. And again, I'm taking a very UK perspective here, but alongside, so people sometimes shift the argument and say, well, okay, it's not that children's screen time overall has gone up, but they've made this transition from old school screen time like TV to smartphones, and smartphones are uniquely harmful because of the reasons that have been outlined. How do you then explain that in the same period, this is the percentage of children entering school who've achieved a good level of development? And I can explain what that means, but it's a validated and kind of consistent standard applied across the country, has gone up year on year during that period. And child development is generally improving, and kind of academic results are generally improving, and all of those things. And I don't see, and people will come back to me and say, well, I see all these really complicated children and these lots and lots of children with autism, and I never saw them 10 years ago. Well, you didn't, because they weren't coming to you, not because they didn't exist. I think there's an evidence that the actual prevalence of developmental disorders has risen in the period during which we've had this technological revolution. So to go back to the NHS digital data, between 2004 and 2017, there's been zero increase in ADHD, zero increase in autism. And yet, of course, in terms of referrals, we've had massively increased levels. I'm sure you have in India as well, probably from a very low baseline. But I think this is largely to do with relabeling children who previously would be called, say, learning disability, or conversely, other sort of behavioral problems, and acknowledging the neurodevelopmental aspects of them, and also a kind of broadening of diagnostic categories and diagnostic understandings, particularly as regards females. I think it's generally a good thing, but I don't think it reflects a deterioration of child development. It certainly doesn't in the UK, and I suspect it doesn't in India. Of course, we have a lovely and big cohort of people who are of Indian origin in the UK, and many of my colleagues fall into that category. And we know that they do well from a mental health point of view. They do well from a developmental point of view, and they have not had a kind of deterioration that you might suggest. So just to say that there's not, this isn't to do with UK people being different to Indian people, because an awful lot of people in England, in the UK, in a sense. So then quickly, because I'm a paediatrician, I want to talk about physical health. And I think when we did a systematic review in preparation for writing the college guidance, we did do a systematic review, and we did find some links with obesity, and it's not a big surprise. It is, after all, largely a sedentary activity, almost entirely sedentary activity, screen time. I think we do have to think about that, and so one of the things we've recommended is to do with snacking during screen time. But on the other hand, I do think that screen time is a very minor factor compared to the economic drivers for obesity. In the UK, for instance, obesity is becoming increasingly a condition of the poor, which doesn't really add up to it being screen time, because there isn't necessarily a huge poverty gradient to do with screen time. I think it's much more to do with the way that unhealthy food is cheaper. And the other thing that people do bring up is myopia. And it's certainly true that close working, a lifetime, a childhood where you are spending much more time looking at things which are close to you, is more likely to lead to nearsightedness. But the onset of the change to close working from kind of more distant use of your eyes in childhood far precedes the internet. So yes, close working is associated with myopia, but what are we going to do? Stop them going to school? So I don't really think we can put myopia at the door of the internet either. But I want to acknowledge the fact that things may feel worse. Things may feel like families are more under pressure. People are, finding more complex difficulties. And I think to an extent it's because of the reach of our services has increased. And I think it's also because simply the pressures of modern life, the pressures of economic life, the increased emphasis on performance management, the balancing of career against family for both male and female partners. So I think things are very tough for people, but that's not the same as things going downhill necessarily. There's always this kind of going to hell in a handcart narrative, and this is a very ancient sort of illuminated manuscript from the medieval times. There's always this kind of idea that things are getting worse, which is shared by people in the media, perhaps people of a more conservative bent. But actually, if things were always going to hell in a handcart, things would be pretty bad by now, and they're just not. We still have. We still have the mental health we had 50 years ago with children broadly, and we still have a remarkable, resilient and fascinating group of youth coming through, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure in India as well. So my point here overall is that at a population level, the narrative of screen time leading to worse outcomes doesn't add up. However, that's not to say that there's no such thing as problematic screen use at an individual level, at a clinical level, and clearly there is. I see lots of kids whose screen use is problematic. But the question is, how do you define problematic screen use? Because that becomes important when you're giving recommendations to colleagues as to how to manage it. So there is obviously duration-based criteria, which I know that have been acknowledged, have been adopted in India, as well as in America, in a kind of, well, Chhitij has done a very good job of explaining this, and the World Health Organization. I just think it's scientifically unsound, for the reasons that I've outlined, to say that there is a correlation between duration of screen time counted in this very bald way and well-being of any kind. There just doesn't seem to me to be the scientific basis for it. And also, you end up doing all sorts of weird things about, well, it counts as screen time if you're talking to your friends on WhatsApp, but not if you're talking to your granny and you've got video on. It counts as screen time if you're doing homework, but what if you're watching a video which is of a play that you're watching for English, but it's not strictly homework? Does that count? It just becomes very messy and muddy, and what we basically end up doing is it counts as screen time, kids, if we approve of it, if we don't approve of it. And that's a dangerous path to go down. So I just don't buy that the duration-based guidance is particularly effective. I don't think it's effective at all. I think that people ignore it, and I think there's data from India that you've just seen that suggests that people ignore it. So I just don't think it's particularly effective or scientifically sound way of going forward. Now, what about content criteria? Why don't we sort of think that, look for good versus bad content? And again, we have the problem of importing our own moral judgment. So Fortnite is often a game that people worry about. I noticed the Clash of Clans was specifically referenced in the Indian guidance, which if I was the publisher, I would be quite pleased by. Fortnite, I think Fortnite's almost entirely harmless, actually. I do support the idea that certification systems in video games should be adhered to, or at least paid attention to by families. And I often point families towards websites such as Common Sense Media to see what is going to be suitable. And I don't want, 9-year-olds exposed to ultra-violent or sexual content, of course. But gaming itself, even gaming which is conflict or violence-based, doesn't seem to be causing any problems. And actually, Fortnite is quite a constructive game in lots of ways. You cooperate, you build, and yeah, you shoot people. On the other hand, you could say, well, we should just be doing educational stuff. But the point about the evidence is that you can learn stuff from things like the thing on the right, which is Horrible Histories, which is a BBC show that I think is absolutely marvelous. And well, by all means, have a look at it. But you can't really learn skills from the TV, so you do need that interaction in order to learn skills, and there is a limit to what benefit you can get from so-called positive screen time. I think the data on the effectiveness of remote teaching is still coming in, and it's very interesting to know it, but I suspect there will be some limitations to what can be done. So they were cautious about content criteria because I think it's such a fast-moving situation, and also we just end up importing our own value judgments. So a little bit think about internet addiction, because it is sort of assumed that this is a thing. I just want to be a bit cautious about it, because I don't see much evidence in the literature. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about what is addiction and what is just habit, essentially, or kind of, just really being into something. The difference between, and for me, the most important difference between being addicted to something and just really liking it. So I really like swimming, and I get grumpy if I can't go swimming at the weekends, but I don't think I'm addicted to swimming necessarily, because I don't have tolerance to swimming. So I don't think there's much evidence of tolerance and withdrawal symptoms in internet addiction, as in tolerance meaning you need more and more and more and more to get your fix, which you get with caffeine, for instance. That's, tolerance and addiction to caffeine is I think caffeine is a much more kind of convincing case for being an addiction than the internet. And the other thing that makes me a little bit worried about it is how variable the prevalence is in different studies, depending on how you measure it. There's some really remarkable prevalences of like 70% in adolescents of internet addiction, which doesn't seem to me to make sense. And I just kind of wonder what you're actually measuring there. And I think there's a really good quote from Mark Griffiths, who's the first person ever to have written a paper on internet addiction. So he's very much an authority, although I don't agree with everything he said. But he said that the overwhelming majority of so-called internet addicts are no more addicted to the internet than alcoholics are addicted to the actual bottle. So the internet is a vessel through which you indulge in your addiction to gambling, to gaming, to sex, whatever you happen to be addicted to. And I think you can argue, therefore, that there are certain activities that are addictive, truly addictive, or in that they induce tolerance and withdrawal, and that the internet is a way of accessing those activities. And then, in fact, we should be focusing on the activities themselves. And of course, Chhitij is right. We should also be focusing on the context. So then we talk about social media, and I think also this kind of plays into the discussion about, well, is smartphones worse than TV? And this is a Douglas Adams quote, and basically, essentially what we're dealing with is things that have, for many of us, been invented after we're 35, and we are immediately going to be suspicious of them because that's human nature. Many of us are kind of very, very kind of enthusiastic about the bits of in the internet which we're familiar with, and actually very few people do talk about Facebook as being harmful, but it's more moved onto Instagram. The kind of the worry about adolescent mental health has moved onto Instagram, partly because that's where they are, but also because it's a new thing, and so therefore is against the natural order of things. The other thing about social media. Sorry, how much?
5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
That'd be okay?
Yeah, fine. The other thing about social media is I like this kind of analogy a lot. This is the mirror of Erised from Harry Potter, and those of you who aren't aware, what the mirror of Erised does is it shows you what is it that you desire most, but it doesn't give it to you, which is a lot like Instagram. And I think so that kind of fear of missing out for vulnerable people can be one element which can be can erode at their social media, can erode at their self-esteem and therefore their well-being. The other element, of course, is access to toxic people. There are lots of ways of accessing toxic people and toxic interactions in life, and it happens in everyday life, but of course it's supercharged by the internet. So if you're a vulnerable person with eroding self-esteem, yes, of course, the social media is a very good way of people who are going to erode your self-esteem and your mental health to get at you. So what we choose, and this is what the kind of conclusion part really, is impact criteria. I think that's the best way of looking at what is excessive or problematic screen time. So sleep, big impact, and we're big into sleep and at the Royal College, and it's important, and I would refer you to Matthew Walker's excellent book, Why We Sleep. So if there's an impact on academic work, yes, that could well be a reason, and family functioning, those are the other things. And it's quite right that in individual families, it can lead to that problem. So then you've got the question, well, what are you doing? Are you giving advice, or are you presenting an ideal? And my worry about the Indian guidance is it is a bit idealized, and it's a bit kind of unattainable, I think, from a lot of places where families actually are. I think it's much better to give advice about, okay, here's where you are. How do you get to somewhere a little bit better? That seems to me a much better way of proceeding. So this is our conclusion. This is what we got to, is the questions. So this is the questions. Ask yourself, do you have a problem? Is family screen time under control, including parent screen time? It isn't just children's screen time. And actually, in fairness, the Indian guidance is good on that. Does it interfere with your family activities, the things you as a family want to do? And I mean, not just you as parents want the children to do, what everyone wants to do. Does it interfere with that? Does it interfere with sleep? You should obviously be not taking your devices to bed, and ideally have, if you have a sleep problem, an hour screen free before bed, but sometimes that's not possible. And are you in control of snacking? Because that's the kind of additional feature, as well as it being sedentary, that sometimes can make obesity worse if you have relatively high levels of screens. Have a plan, stick to it, think about your own media time, and be snack aware, and also the one that I've just covered in my thing. Oh yeah, and so it is important to prioritize face-to-face interaction. So all the things that Chhitij just said are true at an individual level if you have a problem. But then you've got to be really careful to think, is it a screen problem, or is it a parenting problem? Is this oppositional behavior that the parents are not able to control, which is manifesting as a screen problem? Is it about family discord? Is the child either using screens to kind of manipulate or affect family relationships, or are they hiding from family discord? Are they hiding from domestic violence? Are they, are they kind of squirreling themselves away because they can't cope with the family? Is this someone who's withdrawn because of anxiety and low mood, and the thing they've withdrawn to is World of Warcraft? So, or is this somebody who's a school avoidant? And that made me think, Chhitij, one of Chhitij's I think autistic cases really made me think, well, actually this feels to me like school avoidance, which is manifesting itself through an internet, sort of a strong interest in the internet, a strong interest in screens. So that was what I had to say. I have finished on time, which is marvelous. I'm sure that not everyone agrees with the cases I've put in. The case I've put in is certainly not necessarily it's not necessarily that you do, but I think that we've got to the same place more or less in terms of how we manage this. But I think in terms of public health advice, I would just say perhaps we need to think a little bit about what's actually going to move people forward. And that's my Twitter account and email if you want to get in touch.
That's great. Thank you so much, Max. A very thought-provoking summary. And for me, certainly as a clinician who has worked through COVID in particular across both India and the UK, it did raise quite a few questions, particularly around some of the interesting data you brought up. Few similarities, yes, base similarities, potentially a few differences. You mentioned the nature of the screen time has changed, not the amount of screen time. And I do wonder about this variability in the context of online education and the patterns around that. It was very different across India and the UK, and of course the phases and the phases of lockdown, as also, you know, access to gadgets and potentially how schools were able to structure this balance. The second point you raised was also quite interesting about the 1% increase in mental health prevalence with CAMPS populations. And I suppose from an Indian perspective, I would question as to whether it's a lot more, possibly because of better knowledge or engagement or diagnostic processes, potentially a differing or more aware access to infrastructure.
So just to come back to you on that,
there's been a, yeah.
Just to come back to you on that, because the NHS Digital is a population study, so it's not to do with services or recognition or any of those things. It is just what is there out there in the population. And of course, most of those kids who would be diagnosable are not diagnosed, and that's true in the UK. Historically, about 1 in 4 who could have a diagnosis actually get to a mental health service, and it hasn't, I'm afraid, got that much better over time. I think we were probably making a bit of progress before the pandemic, but now things have wheels have come off again. So I think, I don't know. I mean, I think it would have, you know, you wish that you could have had, I don't know, maybe there were robust population surveys of the Indian child population prior to the onset of you know, screens and smartphones. I don't know if that exists. But I'm just really struck by the fact that this 10% has really been stuck in the UK population for 50 years through everything that's been happening.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, in terms, I suppose one question that comes up really is about variations, whether it's connected to, I mean, apart from the differences in socio-demographic profiles across continents, whether it's to do with proportionality, the interactions, or individual access and control issues come in as well. And where does one strike a balance? Where does policy come in, and at what point, and all of that? So all very interesting questions. We have only about 10 minutes for questions. So we'll go with what Soumitra was saying earlier on, that if people could type up their questions, if it's not possible for our speakers to answer today, then it can be taken up hopefully later and put up on the CAMPS website. There is a question to both our speakers. Just bear with me. Yeah, so one of the questions that has cropped up is around, is it valid to make a diagnosis of ASD in the background of understimulation and excess screen exposure due to COVID-19?
I think
as the parents explain often.
I have
Sorry?
answered that. I tried to
you
answer
have answered that question
already. So essentially, I mean, I don't think screen time would lead to ASD. What the point when I said it's bi-directional, what I really meant was that if a child has ASD and they may be more likely to engage in screen time activities, which may be at the cost of other stimulation, maybe at the cost of parent interaction, and that may lead to increase in their autism symptoms, because we know a lot of therapies are based on interactive games for autism. So that way it can lead to increase in autism symptoms. That's why it becomes bi-directional. And I've tried to answer that question in the chat as well.
a couple of things that I wanted to just clarify. When Max, when you mentioned about when you compare television and video games were more interactive, I think I was making a different point. What I was saying in an Indian context, when kids are on the smartphones, it's pretty much a solitary activity. Interaction on TV means that you're sitting with your parent, watching a television program and talking about it. So that's how I see it becoming more interactive. I completely agree that video games are obviously much more interactive, especially with all the online games, but that's not what I was referring to at that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think thinking about it, you're talking about young children using smartphones who presumably will not be playing online games. And so actually for those particular population, it probably is more sedentary for that population, because it is more sedentary. More solitary for a child to be on their phone on their own than to be sitting with a parent watching TV. But on the other hand, I know it's not, but if you've got an iPad and you're doing a game and your parent is helping you with that game, and sometimes it's to do with just the size of the screen, isn't it? Whereas if you're watching TV on your own, then it's solitary. So I think you're right. On average, there probably is a gradient there. So yeah, no, I would concede that.
And the other difference from UK and India, because I've worked in UK for a long time before I came back to India. So in UK, screens were introduced in our lives very gradually. So we all had time to adjust to it. There has been a very sudden boom in India. So parents and kids have both been exposed to screen time at the same time. So it is both of them learning to use their smartphones together. And kids are clearly much more clever when it comes to these gadgets. So parents don't know where to put boundaries. Whereas in UK, parents had been exposed to some screen for some time before the kids came in their life. So that way, parenting becomes more difficult here.
Yeah, I can see that.
So, so it's been a massive boom in use of smartphones. So, families with very little education, they would be able to afford a smartphone with access to internet. Is very cheap in India these days, very cheap. So, a kid will have access to pretty much everything online, and it's not supervised. It's not supervised. So it's slightly different the disparity context here.
Yeah, absolutely. The disparity, I think, in the parental knowledge as well, and the child's knowledge is what I think, Chhitij, you highlight as more of a complexity here. And also, there has been an interesting conversation, I think, through your presentations about the role of TV and potentially whether it's beneficial or not. And I suppose one of the other points that has been raised over time really is about TV, the TV kind of being the center or the epicenter of the kind of family gathering together, where at least there is a sense of a more controlled kind of screen time, if for want of a better word, and also potential for bonding, perhaps in a more, perhaps not in a directly interactive way, but certainly in an interactive way in many other forms, even if you're sharing the popcorn. So, in that sense, I think really the role of the modality that's being used does become particularly pertinent. Again, because in rural India, it's still TV, as we can see. So in that sense, I think if we are to look at East-Western perspectives, where does one strike a balance? I think that's these are all kind of questions that are cropping up. So just if anyone, I think there's another question here.
There's a couple in the Q&A as well that are coming up, and there's a couple in the chat that have come up as well.
Right. So should we discourage parents not to use screen whilst feeding when clearly the kids refuse to eat until that's provided? Someone asks, should we allow it? Well,
I think it's one of those. I wanted to quickly my general advice is if you don't have a feeding problem, then I'm pretty relaxed about whether you use screens during meals, because I have, families that don't have a table, so it's very hard to have that kind of traditional around the table because they can't afford a table. So on the other hand, if you have a feeding problem and you are using screens to kind of deal with your feeding problem, that's not necessarily a sustainable or positive way to deal with your feeding problem. You then need to think about feeding and think about what it is that's, why meals have become this great kind of battle, and what it is about your dynamics that's caused that battle, rather than taking what can be, I completely concede, an easy way out by just giving them an iPad and then, you know, spooning it into their mouth, that's not a long-term sustainable and helpful solution to their feeding problem. But then you have to step back and say, is the feeding problem the iPad, or is the feeding problem the child's autism, or the family dynamics around feeding, or the sensory issues that the child has?
I completely agree with you, Max. In India, there's also a feeders problem. So the feeders are obsessed with making sure the child eats enough.
Do you know what? I have noticed that in South Asian families within Lambeth as well. It is a very, very strong feature.
Yes. So they want to feed the child as quickly as possible using anything that they can get hold of. So smartphones are.
And I think, I mean, it is a universal of parents feeling bad, and it almost uniquely touches into the parental guilt nerve if you can't feed your child. If you can't feed your child, you're not a good parent. And so the levels of anxiety, parental anxiety in feeding clinics are off the scale often. And so we've just got to, I mean, so as well as saying this isn't the right way of doing it, we have to have a deep empathy for people, because culturally it is such a pressure.
Penelope has raised a query suggested by difference in brain activity. Basically, whether, I suppose the question is whether, what is the evidence and what are your thoughts around kind of access and exposure to child pornography?
I think she's talking about violent pornography, not necessarily child
impact
pornography.
on families, whether, come again? Oh, sorry, sorry, addiction to pornography. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I think I need to say that I don't know enough about it. I know that clearly we should be protecting children from access to pornography, but it is a fact of life, particularly for adolescents. We need to be skeptical, however, about immediately blaming sexual violence on pornography when there is. And I mean, I don't want to speak for India, but there's certainly in Britain huge cultural problems around respect for women and respect for consent. And we're having huge, controversy around the police in Britain at the moment in London. So it's a societal problem that I think we can end up blaming pornography for. So yes, of course, we should protect children from pornography, but then we also need to think about the rest of society and how it's a mirror of that rather than the other way around.
It has to be a very complex thing. So a child who's accessing pornography also would have other problems, may have a lot of other conduct problems. So he would anyway have this thing about underage sex and prohibited sexual activities. So there may be other things rather than just that exposure to porn, that pre-existing vulnerability would have directed him to access porn and also try to assault his sister. So it wouldn't be as straightforward as just exposure to porn would cause these. But lots of kids accidentally get exposed to porn. In India, the internet is unguarded. So most people would not use any child guard or anything. So if your child has a smartphone in India, he can accidentally come across such thing. And I do see lots of kids who are accidentally seeing something. They feel ashamed. Some kids feel ashamed. Some kids start to enjoy it. So different kids will have different experiences.
So many thanks, Chhitij and Max, for your time and your expertise today. I think if we were to kind of wrap up really and talk about striking a balance, I think we just need to be cognizant of the fact that there could also be vulnerabilities, whether it's to do with age, development, temperament, environment, genetic factors. It is a complex interplay. So it's just, yes, it does at some point clinically come down to a case by case. With a good knowledge of kind of general populational and scientific studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good.
We will start at 6:10. That will be a session on deliberate self-harm chaired by John and Satya.